Over the decades, Craftsman has offered a variety of accessories and attachments for their classic drill press line. This video is part 5 in a series of videos talking about some of these accessories and attachments. If you haven't watched any of the other videos in this series, I recommend you check them out. In this video, we will be talking about the Pressmate Table Lift Attachment. Hello everyone, I'm Jeff and welcome to my shop. We got a lot to discuss, so let's get to it. In the second video of this series, we talked about the drill press head and table lift system that was manufactured by Atlas. But this wasn't the only table lift system offered by Craftsman. Starting in 1981, Craftsman began offering a table lift system that was very ingenious and could be adapted to any of the Classic Craftsman drill presses. Really, only 2 requirements existed for this attachment to be used. The first being that the column had to have an outside diameter of 2 3/4 inches, and the second one being that the table had to have a hole in it, much like the chuck key storage location on all of your Classic Craftsman drill presses. Although the name of this attachment, the Pressmate, was never actually identified in any of the catalogs, the literature that came with the device clearly had the name Pressmate on it. The Craftsman model number for this device was 9-27587, and Craftsman sold it from 1981 to 1985. The Pressmate consisted of 13 major parts and utilized a bicycle chain and a counterweight system to lift and lower the table with a crank. It had a range of about 36 inches, and one of the unique features and differences between this and the table lift system is that you could rotate the table while lifting it or lowering it. In researching who actually made the Pressmate for Craftsman, the only things that I could find were information related to the trademark. And as you can see, this trademark was registered on October 5th, 1982 to the National Marketing and Manufacturing Incorporated, an Idaho corporation. And with the trademark information, there's an individual, Fred Flam, identified. And Flam, I assume, is a law firm located in Los Angeles. And that's all we get as far as the trademark, and there's no patent registered. So perhaps National Marketing was just the company that handled this for them, or this is the company that manufactured it. In any case, they're defunct now and the trademark is expired. This is a completely disassembled Pressmate. And here we can see the owner's manual with the model number, the rubber cork clutch, the weight, the bicycle chain. This is the guide clamp assembly. Notice the track that is on the top part. A bearing rides inside that. And that's the bearing. That allows you to rotate the table around the column. You have the clutch spring. You have 4 push-on external retaining rings. The drive shaft. It has a cutout in it for a roll pin. This is the clutch gear that the chain rides on. And that's the roll pin that retains the clutch gear on the shaft. You have a clutch plate. And you can see where the cork clutch goes in there and the plate sits on top. The crank, and the crank actually rides inside those 2 protrusions. And this is how it came. There was no rolling handle on there. This is all pretty much original hardware. So we're going to assemble this thing and then install it and show you how it works. Just to eliminate some of the clutter here, we'll go ahead and assemble the guide clamp assembly. So it's those 2 half rounds and 2 screws, lock washers, and nuts. And then we'll set that aside. Next we have the drive shaft. We'll go ahead and install the gear on the drive shaft. So that cutout for the roll pin, there's a cutout inside the gear as well. And the roll pin just drops inside there. We'll drive it home with a brass hammer. Make sure it's lined up good. And it protrudes about 1/8 of an inch. Next, we'll go ahead and install the drive shaft into the base. And once it's fully seated, the gear will be in alignment with that curved area there. And that's what keeps the chain on the gear. Yep. So when I disassembled this, there was some sort of dry lubricant on the flat area there that I'm touching, that the cork sits on. I'm not sure what kind of lubricant that was, but we're just going to add a little bit of the super slick stuff to it, wipe it off with a paper towel and spread it around. And we'll do this for the clutch plate and the base. Clean it up. Next, we'll install the spring. There's no top or bottom to it. It can go either way. And then the nut. And this nut compresses the spring and determines just how much positive or negative force the clutch has. We'll just shoot a little super lube on that. And then there's a flat on the drive shaft that the set screw for the crank must engage with. But as I stated earlier, the crank has to engage with those 2 protrusions on the clutch plate. So aligning those 3 things, you're going to have to roll the gear a little bit until it's got the flat facing where the set screw goes. And we're going to have to come back and adjust this further once we go to the installation. And right now it's really hard to turn. So I'm going to back off that nut that adjusts the tension for the spring. And it's still too tight. So I just play with this for a few minutes until I get it where I want it to grab and restrain or retard the crank a little, but enough flow that the crank can turn with minimal resistance. Something like that. Yeah. So next we're going to go ahead and assemble the different parts that connect to the chain, but we need to feed the chain into the gear before we do that. And if there's one thing I don't like about this design is that the chain wants to ride that gear all the way around. Even with the weight on it, you'll see once we have it installed, it still wants to ride up on the gear. Not a huge problem, but maybe a larger weight would alleviate that. Not sure. So now I've placed the base as if it's mounted, so we know what is the top and what is the bottom. And this little 2-hole block or 2-hole piece of steel here is held in place with a cotter pin. Kind of a wonky design, but it works, so you know. And then you get this U-shape steel rod, and it's captured on that 2-hole piece of bar steel with these external push retaining rings, and they are really tough to get on there. So that ain't happening. Yeah, that socket's too big. So we'll just use the bearing. Oddly enough, this bearing is something I've never seen before. There's no bearing number on it. And the inner race is also the shield for the bearing itself. And it's all solid. There's probably ball bearings inside there, but I have no idea how they assembled that sucker. So since it's steel and it's thick, I can go ahead and stick this socket on there and smack it down. It's not going to hurt the bearing in any way. If that was a regular bearing with a steel shield on there, that would damage the bearing, but this isn't hurting it at all. And then we can pop that other external retaining ring on there, and the bearing is captured now. So we just need to do the same thing with this end. And I'm going to need to go to a smaller socket, I think. There we go. And once I've got it on there, I'm going to try to get it as aligned with the bearing as possible, but I don't think it's critical to the operation. And that other external retaining ring is broken, so I had to go to the auto parts store and pick up a package of them. But no big deal. Making sure everything is facing in the correct direction. And then we can drop that last external retaining ring on there. Smack it in place. It would have been easier to do this in the vise, but I was trying to keep it all on camera, and sometimes when I get a little focused on what I'm doing, I don't really think about, hey, let's do it this way. It would be so much easier, but no big deal. So there we go. All that is assembled. And now we just need to install the weight on the other end of the chain. And again, it's held in place with a cotter pin. Like so. So the last thing is the hardware for mounting the base, which is one screw with a washer, a lock nut, and a lock washer and the nut. So here we are at the, this is a commercial drill press, Craftsman commercial 15.5 inch Emerson Gen 4 drill press. But this would work on that 150 you can see in the background. It would work on any of the Classic Craftsman Drill Presses. So the first thing is just installing the guide clamp assembly. And this just wraps around the column. You want to have it sitting below the head, and if you are using a column clamp below the head, then this would go below that column clamp. But you need to have it stand off from whatever's above it, about 1.5 inches to 2 inches, so that the bearing doesn't interfere with any of that. Next, we've got the base, and you just sit it on the table. I'm just going to drop the screw in from the top for the time being. We'll move the camera to the back side. Next, we're going to extend the chain so that we can hook that bearing on the guide clamp assembly. Like so. Now, alignment of the base is kind of important. You got to have the lock handle for the table between the base and the chain. And this one has an extended lock handle, but a regular lock handle would still work fine. And key here is to make sure that the crank clears the table. So we're going to drop the screw in from the bottom coming up through the table, because the pocket that that screw sits in is too small to get any, like a socket or any other tools in there. And then we've got the washer, the lock washer, and then the nut. And here's where we've got to play with the crank and the base nut. If we lock it down, then I'm not going to be able to remove the crank or move the crank because it's hitting on the table. So we loosen it back up. And we're going to need to undo that set screw for the crank. And stand the crank off of the clutch plate a little. So it just takes some playing with it to get all this to line up properly. Kind of feel like they should have made the crank stand off like an inch away from the table, and that would have been a better design, but no big deal. And again, the crank has to ride in those two protrusions on the clutch plate. And clear the table. But once we've got it all lined up properly, we can tighten down the nut that holds the base to the table. And then tighten down the crank. And now it's installed. So how does it work? Well, you loosen the table lock. And right now the table is resting on a column clamp. And then we can raise up the table. Now we can tighten up that nut for the clutch that it would have a more positive grabbing power, but then you just lock the table down at the height you want to work on. And if you want to rotate the table, you can loosen the table lock, and then, well, we'll raise it up and down a little more. No big deal. Okay, so now we'll rotate it. So holding the table, we can rotate it, and you can see how that bearing will travel around the guide clamp assembly. Now it doesn't want to move past the gap or the connection between the two parts of that guide assembly, but moving around one half of it, it moves pretty well. So we could rotate this table enough to get the auxiliary table in play with the drill. But that's the operation of it. And this will wrap up the video. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.